"You're no longer my child." That was the text message my mother sent me at 10:17 on a Tuesday morning. No warning, no argument the night before, no explanation. Just 7 words that somehow erased 38 years of being her son. I stared at my phone while the conference room around me blurred into background noise. Someone was discussing quarterly numbers. A projector hummed softly. Coffee cups sat scattered across the table. Life kept moving as if nothing had happened. But for me, everything had just shifted. A second message arrived less than a minute later. "Don't contact me again." I read both messages 3 times. Then 4. Then 5. I was waiting for the part that would make sense. Waiting for the punchline. Waiting for some indication that this was a mistake. It never came. My mother, Linda Whitmore, had always been dramatic. She could turn a minor disagreement into a family crisis faster than anyone I had ever known. But this felt different. This felt deliberate, cold, final. I excused myself from the meeting and walked down a quiet hallway lined with framed company awards. My reflection followed me in the glass. I looked calm. That surprised me. I thought I would be angry. I thought I would call immediately. Instead, I sat alone in my office and opened my banking app. For 15 years, on the first business day of every month, an automatic transfer had gone from my account to my mother's. The amount had changed over the years, but the habit never had. After my father died, I told myself it was the right thing to do. She was grieving. She needed support. 1 month became 12. 12 became 5 years. 5 became 15. The transfer was scheduled to process again in 3 days. I stared at the screen for a long moment. Then I canceled it. No speech. No angry text. No dramatic announcement. Just a few taps on a screen. After that, I blocked her number. The silence that followed felt strange. Not painful. Not satisfying. Just strange, like closing a door in a house you had lived in your entire life. I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window toward the parking lot below. The Texas sun reflected off rows of cars. People walked to lunch. Somewhere, life was continuing exactly as it had before. Yet I couldn't stop thinking about those 7 words. "You're no longer my child." The more I repeated them in my head, the less they sounded emotional. They sounded calculated. My mother knew exactly what those words would do. She knew how much weight they carried. She knew I had spent years trying to be the dependable son, the responsible one, the one who always answered the phone, the one who paid the bills nobody talked about, the one who never said no. Around noon, I opened our old message thread. Birthdays, holiday plans, doctor appointments, requests. So many requests. Looking back, I noticed something unsettling. Nearly every conversation ended with me helping solve a problem. A payment, a repair, a prescription, a favor. Somehow I had never questioned it. Family helps family. That was what I believed. But sitting there alone in my office, reading years of messages, I realized something I should have noticed long ago. Almost every time my mother reached out, she needed something. And for the first time in 15 years, she wasn't getting it. What I didn't know then was that her text message wasn't written in a moment of anger. It wasn't impulsive. It wasn't emotional. It was part of a decision she had already made. And before the week was over, I would discover exactly why she thought she no longer needed me. The next morning, I woke up at 6:30, the same way I had for years. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, painting thin lines across the kitchen floor. I poured a cup of coffee and stood by the window, looking out at a neighborhood that had not changed much in a decade. Everything felt ordinary. That was the strange part. I had expected anger, regret, some urge to fix what had happened. Instead, I felt a quiet distance settling in. As I sat at the table, memories began surfacing one after another. 15 years earlier, when my father passed away, my mother had seemed lost. She had lived with him for more than 40 years. Suddenly, she was alone in a house that felt too large and too quiet. I remember driving over every weekend. I fixed things around the house. I mowed the lawn. I handled paperwork she did not want to look at. When she worried about money, I told her not to. I promised I would help. At first, it was a few $100s a month. Then property taxes increased. Then medical expenses appeared. Then there were home repairs. Every year brought a new reason. Every year the amount grew. I never questioned it because I believed that was what family did. My wife asked once if I was certain my mother needed as much help as she claimed. I remember defending her immediately. I told my wife she did not understand. I told her mom had sacrificed so much raising us. Looking back, I realized how quickly I dismissed any concern. I wanted to believe I was doing the right thing. Over time, helping my mother became part of my routine. The transfer left my account every month just like a utility bill. Predictable, automatic, permanent. What I rarely talked about was how often she called when something went wrong. If her water heater failed, she called me. If her car needed repairs, she called me. If she felt overwhelmed by paperwork, she called me. I always answered. My younger sister Ashley rarely did. That was not a secret. Even family gatherings seemed to follow the same pattern. Ashley arrived late, left early, and somehow escaped every responsibility. Yet my mother always had an explanation ready. Ashley was busy. Ashley was stressed. Ashley had a lot on her plate. I accepted those explanations for years. I do not know why. Maybe because questioning them felt disloyal. Maybe because I had spent so long trying to be the dependable son that I forgot to ask whether anyone else was carrying their share. Later that afternoon, I opened an old photo album stored in a cabinet near my desk. There was my father standing beside a fishing boat at a lake outside Austin. There was Mom smiling beside him. There was Ashley and me as teenagers. Looking through those pictures, I noticed something painful. In every memory, I could clearly remember what I had given. My time, my energy, my support. But I struggled to remember the last time my mother had asked how I was doing. The realization sat heavily with me, not because it answered any questions, but because it created new ones. And somewhere in those unanswered questions was the reason she had decided she no longer needed me. For the next few days, I tried to focus on work, but old memories kept resurfacing when I least expected them. The strange thing was that none of them seemed important when they happened. They were small moments, passing comments, tiny decisions, the kind of things families rarely stop to analyze. Yet once I started looking back, the pattern became impossible to ignore. I remembered a Thanksgiving dinner 3 years earlier. My mother had thanked Ashley for helping organize the meal while everyone sat around the table. I smiled and said nothing, even though I had paid for most of the groceries and spent nearly 6 hours preparing food that morning. At the time, it did not bother me, or at least I told myself it did not. Then another memory surfaced. My mother had needed a new roof after a storm damaged part of her house. I had written a check without hesitation. A few weeks later, during a family gathering, she told relatives that Ashley had been the one who stepped up when things got difficult. I remember hearing those words and feeling confused for a second before pushing the feeling aside. It seemed easier not to challenge her, easier not to create tension. Looking back, that had become my role in the family. Keep the peace, stay quiet, carry the weight. One evening, I sat in my home office and opened an old folder filled with financial records. Originally, I was looking for something unrelated, but as I sorted through documents, I found years of receipts, invoices, and bank confirmations connected to my mother. Car repairs, insurance premiums, property taxes, medical expenses. The stack grew larger with every file I opened. I was not angry, not yet. Mostly I felt surprised. I had never seen all the evidence gathered in one place before. Each payment had seemed small when viewed alone. Together they told a different story. Then Ashley crossed my mind again. My sister had always lived differently than I did. She moved from opportunity to opportunity, rarely staying in one place very long. Somehow she always seemed to have money for vacations, concerts, and expensive dinners. Whenever I questioned how she managed it, my mother would laugh and say Ashley had a talent for finding her way. At the time, I accepted that explanation. Now I found myself wondering how much of that success had actually been funded by sacrifices nobody acknowledged. The question lingered longer than I wanted it to. 2 days later, my phone lit up with an unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it. Something made me answer. A calm female voice introduced herself as Diane Harper. The name sounded familiar. Then I remembered. Diane had been one of my mother's closest friends for years. We exchanged a few polite words before she paused. There was hesitation in her voice, as though she expected me to already know something. Finally, she asked a question that instantly made my stomach tighten. She said she had been meaning to ask for a long time why I had stopped helping my mother financially years ago. I stared at the wall in silence. Because according to everything I knew, I had never stopped helping her at all. For several seconds, I could not answer Diane. I thought I had misheard her. Then she repeated the question more carefully, almost apologetically. She said my mother had been telling people for years that I stopped helping after my father's death, and that Ashley had stepped in to support her when nobody else would. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. The room suddenly felt smaller. Diane must have sensed something was wrong because her voice softened. She asked if everything was all right. I told her the truth. I said I had never stopped helping. Not once. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Diane finally spoke again, she sounded genuinely shocked. She said that could not be right. She explained that for years she had listened to my mother praise Ashley's generosity while describing me as distant and uninterested. According to those stories, Ashley was the daughter who sacrificed. Ashley was the one paying bills. Ashley was the one making sure their mother stayed comfortable. Diane even mentioned specific conversations, birthday lunches, church gatherings, coffee meetings. The story had always been the same. Ashley was the hero. I was the disappointment. I walked to my desk and pulled out a folder containing recent bank records. One by one, I spread them across the surface. Dates, transfers, confirmation numbers. The evidence was sitting right in front of me. Yet somehow an entirely different version of reality had been presented to everyone around my mother. Diane asked if I could prove what I was saying. I almost laughed at the question, not because it was offensive, because I realized I could prove every dollar, every month, every year. 15 years of records existed. 15 years of quiet support. 15 years of obligations I had never discussed with anyone because I believed family matters stayed private. Diane became quiet again. Then she said something that stayed with me long after the call ended. She said she always wondered why I never defended myself. Apparently, there had been moments when relatives questioned my absence or criticized my lack of involvement. According to Diane, my mother never corrected them. She simply let them believe whatever they wanted. After we ended the conversation, I sat alone for nearly an hour. My mind replayed dozens of family gatherings. Suddenly, small details looked different. Comments I once ignored now carried new meaning. Relatives had occasionally thanked Ashley for helping Mom. Neighbors had praised her dedication. Friends had complimented her generosity. Every time, Ashley accepted the praise without hesitation. Not once had she redirected it. Not once had she corrected the story. I opened social media for the first time in weeks and scrolled through old photographs. There was Ashley standing beside Mom at a charity event. Another picture showed them smiling at a restaurant. Underneath, comments described Ashley as a devoted daughter, a blessing, a source of support. I felt something shift inside me. Not anger. Not yet. Something colder. Something clearer. For years I believed I was helping my mother survive. Now I was beginning to suspect I had been financing a story in which I did not even exist. And if Diane had been told that lie, I could not help wondering how many other people had heard the exact same version. The following weekend, I decided to stop relying on assumptions and start looking at facts. For years I had treated the monthly transfers as routine, something so familiar that I rarely examined them. Now I opened every account statement I could access and began organizing them by year. The process took hours. Numbers filled my screen. Dates stretched back further than I expected. What started as a simple review slowly became something else. A pattern emerged. Then another. Then another. By Sunday afternoon, my dining room table was covered with folders, notes, and printouts. I added the totals several times because I thought I must have made a mistake. The number kept coming back the same. Over 15 years, I had transferred more than $450,000 connected to my mother's support. I sat there staring at the figure. Not because I regretted helping. I did not. What unsettled me was realizing how little I actually knew about where the money had gone. I began tracing larger payments. Property taxes matched records. Insurance payments matched records. But scattered throughout the years were dozens of transfers labeled with vague descriptions. Emergency help, temporary assistance, family expenses, special circumstances. At the time, I never asked questions. If Mom said she needed help, I helped. That was the entire conversation. Now those old entries felt different. I searched through emails and messages connected to specific dates. Slowly, details resurfaced. One transfer coincided with Ashley taking a vacation to California. Another appeared only weeks before she purchased a new vehicle. Yet another matched the timing of a luxury apartment she briefly rented after moving out of a previous place. Individually, none of those events proved anything. Together, they formed a picture I could no longer ignore. The more I looked, the more uncomfortable I became. Several times I pushed away from the table and walked outside just to clear my head. The Texas heat lingered well into the evening. Neighborhood lights flickered on one by one. Families sat on porches. Dogs barked in the distance. Everything looked normal. Meanwhile, my understanding of my own family was changing by the hour. Late Sunday night, I found something that stopped me completely. It was an old email from my mother sent nearly 6 years earlier. She had thanked me for covering an urgent financial problem. Attached was a short explanation describing unexpected expenses. At the time, I accepted it without hesitation. But when I compared the dates with other records, the timeline did not fit. The money had arrived in her account. Within days, a nearly identical amount appeared elsewhere. Not directly to Ashley, but close enough to raise questions. Questions I had never thought to ask. I leaned back in my chair and rubbed my eyes. For years I believed I was helping one person stay secure. Now it looked increasingly possible that I had been supporting far more than that. The realization was painful, not because of the money itself, but because trust had been attached to every dollar. Trust that had never required receipts. Trust that had never demanded proof. Trust that had been given freely. As midnight approached, I gathered the papers into neat stacks. I still did not know the full truth. But one thing had become impossible to deny. Somewhere along the way, the story I had been told and the reality I had funded had become two very different things. Monday morning arrived with an unexpected sense of clarity. For the first time since everything began, I stopped looking backward and started looking for answers in the present. I had spent days reviewing records, revisiting memories, and questioning assumptions. Now I wanted facts. Real facts. The kind that could not be explained away with family stories or emotional appeals. Around noon, my phone rang again. It was Diane. Her voice sounded hesitant, as if she had been debating whether to call. After a few minutes of small talk, she finally told me why. She had recently attended a luncheon with several of my mother's longtime friends. During the conversation, someone mentioned estate planning. According to Diane, my mother proudly announced that everything had already been arranged. At first, Diane thought nothing of it. Then she remembered our previous conversation. She became curious and asked a simple question. Had both children been included equally? The answer surprised her. Diane told me my mother laughed and said there was no reason to divide things equally when only one child had truly been there for her. My stomach tightened. I already knew who she meant. Diane continued. She said my mother spent several minutes praising Ashley. She described her as loyal, generous, and selfless. Then she mentioned me only briefly. According to Diane, my mother told everyone I had chosen my own life years ago and no longer played a meaningful role in the family. I thanked Diane for telling me. After we ended the call, I sat quietly for several minutes. The strange thing was that I no longer felt shocked. Every new detail seemed to fit into a larger picture that had been forming for years without my noticing. That evening, I reviewed more documents. Not financial records this time. Family correspondence, holiday cards, old emails, messages saved over the years. I noticed something unsettling. Whenever my mother spoke privately to me, she emphasized gratitude. She thanked me repeatedly for helping. She praised my reliability. Yet whenever she spoke publicly, at least according to what others described, the story changed completely. It was like watching two versions of the same person exist side by side. One version knew exactly who had provided support. The other version acted as though that support never existed. The contradiction stayed with me. A few days later, another piece of information arrived unexpectedly. One of my cousins called to check on me after hearing rumors about family tension. During the conversation, he casually mentioned that everyone assumed Ashley would eventually inherit the house because she had sacrificed so much to care for Mom. The statement caught me off guard, not because of the inheritance itself, but because the narrative was identical. The same story, the same praise, the same omission. By then, too many people had heard it for it to be accidental. It had been repeated consistently for years. After ending the call, I walked into my office and looked at the stack of records sitting on my desk. 15 years of support, 15 years of trust, 15 years of believing actions mattered more than recognition. Suddenly, a difficult possibility became impossible to ignore. What if the text message had not been an emotional reaction at all? What if it arrived only after certain decisions had already been finalized? The thought lingered in my mind late into the night. Because if that was true, then the message was not the beginning of this story. It was the final step in a plan that had started long before I ever received it. 2 weeks passed, then 3, then 4. I kept my promise to myself. No calls, no messages, no attempts to explain. The silence remained intact. At first, nothing happened, or at least that was how it appeared. Then the cracks started showing. The first sign came through voicemail. Because I had blocked my mother's number, her calls never reached me directly, but some still appeared in a separate folder. There were 3 messages waiting one Friday evening. The first sounded irritated. The second sounded frustrated. By the third, the tone had changed completely. She asked me to call her back as soon as possible. No explanation, no apology, just urgency. I listened once and closed the app. The following week, Ashley called from a number I did not recognize. I answered without thinking. The moment I heard her voice, I understood why she was calling. She skipped every greeting and went straight to the point. Mom was having financial difficulties. Certain bills needed attention. There were expenses that could not wait. I listened quietly. Then I asked a simple question. Why was she calling me if she was the one who had supposedly been supporting Mom all these years? The line went silent. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Ashley changed the subject entirely. That told me everything I needed to know. A few days later, another relative reached out. Then another. Then another. The pattern became impossible to miss. None of them asked how I was doing. None of them mentioned the message that started everything. Instead, every conversation drifted toward concern about my mother's finances. People spoke carefully, as though trying not to reveal too much. Yet each call confirmed the same reality. Something had changed. The support everyone assumed came from Ashley was not appearing. The resources they believed existed were suddenly missing. One evening, Diane called again. This time her voice carried a mixture of sympathy and disbelief. She told me several of my mother's friends were confused. Apparently, Mom had begun complaining about unexpected financial stress. The problem was that her previous stories no longer matched the current situation. People who believed Ashley was providing support could not understand why everything seemed to be unraveling so quickly. Diane said some of them had started asking questions. Real questions. Questions that should have been asked years earlier. That conversation stayed with me. Not because it felt like revenge. It did not. In fact, I found no satisfaction in hearing that things were becoming difficult. What stayed with me was the realization that truth behaves differently than fiction. A story can survive for years if nobody examines it closely. Reality only needs one missing piece before the entire structure starts shaking. By the end of the month, my blocked folder contained more than 40 missed calls connected to my mother. Some came early in the morning. Others arrived late at night. A few were only seconds apart. I never listened to most of them. I already knew what they represented. Not reconciliation, not understanding, not regret, desperation. And for the first time in 15 years, I was not rushing in to solve the problem. I was simply watching the consequences unfold. What I still did not know was how far my mother had gone before sending that final message. But very soon, an unexpected discovery would answer that question once and for all. The answer arrived on a rainy Thursday afternoon. I was sorting through another box of old paperwork when my cousin Mark called. We had never been especially close, but he sounded uncomfortable, as though he was carrying information he was not sure he should share. After a few minutes of conversation, he finally explained why he had reached out. Several months earlier, he had accompanied my mother to an attorney's office because she did not want to drive downtown alone. At the time, he assumed it involved routine estate planning. He never thought much about it afterward. Then the recent family drama started, and certain details began bothering him. I listened carefully as he described the visit. According to Mark, my mother seemed unusually cheerful that day. She talked about putting things in order and making sure the future reflected the people who truly cared about her. The phrase caught my attention immediately. It sounded familiar. Too familiar. Mark hesitated before continuing. He said he remembered hearing my name mentioned briefly during a discussion about beneficiaries. Then he remembered something else. My mother joking that some people only deserved appreciation while they were useful. The comment had seemed strange at the time. Now it sounded different. Much different. After the call ended, I sat motionless in my office. For weeks I had suspected there was more behind the message she sent. Now I was beginning to understand the timeline. The estate planning meeting happened months earlier. The stories about Ashley's sacrifices had been repeated for years. The narrative had already been established long before the final break occurred. Suddenly, everything fit together. The praise, the omissions, the rewritten history. None of it was random. It was preparation. That evening, Diane called once again. She had spoken with another mutual friend who knew more than she originally realized. Apparently, my mother had been telling people that Ashley would eventually receive everything because she had earned it through loyalty and devotion. The description was almost identical to what Mark had heard. Different people, same story, repeated over and over until it became accepted as fact. I opened my desk drawer and looked at the stack of documents I had collected over the previous month. Bank records, emails, receipts, notes. 15 years reduced to paper. For the first time, I stopped asking whether I had been treated fairly. That question no longer mattered. The evidence answered it already. What mattered now was understanding why the final message had arrived when it did. The answer seemed obvious. As long as I remained useful, there was a reason to maintain the relationship. The moment certain decisions were finalized, the relationship became unnecessary. The realization should have hurt more than it did. Instead, it brought an unexpected sense of peace. Because uncertainty had been replaced by clarity, the confusion was disappearing. The contradictions were finally making sense. Late that night, I organized every document into a single folder and placed it on my desk. I had no plans to argue, no plans to chase anyone for explanations. But if a conversation ever happened, I wanted facts ready. Because after weeks of silence, rumors, and half-truths, I had reached one simple conclusion. The story my family believed was built on carefully selected pieces of reality. And sooner or later, those pieces were going to collide with the truth. Nearly a year passed before I saw my mother again. By then, the constant calls had stopped. The messages had disappeared. The pressure from relatives had faded as people gradually pieced together their own conclusions. Life had become quieter. Better, actually. I focused on my business, spent more time with my wife, and rediscovered what it felt like to make decisions without carrying the weight of someone else's expectations. Then one Saturday afternoon, as I was leaving a hardware store, I spotted a familiar figure walking toward the parking lot. It was Linda. She looked older than I remembered. Not dramatically older, just tired. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then she slowly approached. There was no anger in her expression, no confidence either, only hesitation. We stood there in silence before she finally spoke. She asked how I had been. It was such an ordinary question that I almost laughed. After everything that had happened, we were standing in a parking lot discussing the weather and daily life. I answered politely, nothing more. She nodded and looked down for a moment. Then she said something I never expected to hear. She admitted that things had not turned out the way she thought they would. She did not provide details. She did not explain every decision. But she acknowledged enough. Enough for me to understand. The future she had planned had not unfolded as expected. The assumptions she relied on had not held together. The stories that sounded convincing for years became harder to maintain once reality demanded proof. We talked for less than 10 minutes. During that conversation, I realized something important. I no longer needed answers. For months, I thought closure would come from uncovering every detail, every transfer, every conversation, every choice. But standing there, I understood that closure had arrived much earlier. It arrived the moment I stopped chasing approval from people determined not to give it. Before leaving, my mother asked if I was still angry. I considered the question carefully. Then I told her the truth. No, I was disappointed for a long time, confused for a while, hurt more than I wanted to admit. But anger requires energy, and eventually I stopped giving that situation any more of mine. She nodded slowly. We exchanged a brief goodbye and walked in opposite directions. I never reopened the old arguments. I never resumed the financial support, and I never regretted either decision. In the years that followed, I learned a lesson that changed the way I viewed family. Love and obligation are not the same thing. Support and sacrifice are not the same thing. And loyalty means very little when it only travels in one direction. For 15 years, I believed being a good son meant giving without limits. What I finally learned was that healthy relationships require honesty, respect, and accountability from everyone involved, not just one person. Looking back now, I do not think the most important moment was receiving that message. It was what happened afterward. The silence forced me to examine truths I had ignored for years. It forced me to stop measuring my worth through someone else's approval. And in a strange way, the ending I feared became the beginning I needed. Because sometimes losing the role you spent years protecting is the only way to discover who you are without it. And the day I stopped financing a story built on gratitude that never truly existed was the day I finally became free.